the smell of money and gunpowder have more in common than most people think. Both linger, both leave marks on everything they touch. And if you work long enough in a place where both exist in equal measure, you stop noticing either one. Nora Finch had worked the books for Aurelio's for 11 years. Not Aurelio's the restaurant, though the restaurant existed, occupied the ground floor of a limestone building on the corner of Michigan Avenue and Huron, served a $40 risotto that nobody actually came for. Nora worked for Aurelio's, the organization, the one that didn't have a website, the one whose quarterly statements she reconciled every Monday morning in a windowless office on the 3rd floor, cross-referencing cash flows that moved through 17 shell accounts across 4 states, making sure the numbers told exactly the right story, and only that story, to anyone who might come looking. She was good at her job, exceptionally good, and for 11 years nobody had noticed. That was, in fact, the point. Nora was 31 years old, 5'4", and built in the way that department store catalogs called full-figured, and that her mother called sturdy, and that men in the restaurant downstairs called nothing at all, because they didn't look at her long enough to form an opinion. She wore dark blazers that she bought 2 sizes too large. She kept her dark hair in a bun so tight it gave her headaches by noon. She sat in the back of every room she entered, and she learned, very early on, that invisibility was not a burden. It was a skill. She'd understood this at 17, when she figured out that the teachers who forgot she existed also forgot to watch her during exams, and she aced them on her own merits anyway. She'd understood it again at 20, when she realized that nobody interrupts the quiet girl in accounting. Nobody questions her overtime. Nobody wonders what she's actually looking at when she stares at a spreadsheet for 6 hours straight. What Nora was actually looking at, on the Tuesday that changed everything, was a discrepancy. It was small, $43,000, distributed across 11 transactions over the span of 6 weeks, each one just below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic flag. Someone had been careful. Someone had been patient, but not careful enough and not patient enough. Because Nora had a memory like a steel trap and a habit of reading financial statements the way other people read novels, looking for the moment when the narrator slips and tells you something they didn't mean to. She stared at the numbers, stared at the routing codes, stared at the date stamps. Then she sat very still for a very long time, because the account receiving those transfers belonged to Vincent Harlow, and Vincent Harlow was the man who ran security for Cosimo Brandt. Cosimo Brandt. Even thinking the name required a certain steadying of the nerves. He was 41 years old, German-Italian by ancestry, Chicago by choice, and feared by approximately everyone with the good sense to pay attention to their surroundings. He had taken control of the Brandt organization at 33 after his father's stroke, and in 8 years he had done what most people in his position spent entire careers attempting. He had made the organization untouchable, not through brutality, though he was capable of that, everyone knew it, but through intelligence, through patience, through an almost architectural understanding of how power actually functioned, which was quietly, structurally, through the slow accumulation of leverage rather than the loud demonstration of force. He came to Aurelio's every Thursday evening, booth in the back left corner, same table every time, 2 fingers of single malt scotch, no ice, while he reviewed whatever he was reviewing. Sometimes documents, sometimes his phone, sometimes nothing at all, just the middle distance, like he was running calculations in a part of his brain the rest of the world didn't have access to. Nora had served him coffee once, 3 years ago, when the regular floor staff were overwhelmed and the restaurant manager had pulled her down from the 3rd floor to help cover. She'd set the cup down without a word. He'd glanced up. She'd already been walking away. She doubted he remembered it. She remembered everything. The thing about Cosimo Brandt, the thing that the people who feared him most got wrong, was that he wasn't cruel in the way they imagined. He didn't enjoy it. He was, in Nora's assessment after 11 years of observing his organization's financial behavior, something far more dangerous than cruel. He was principled. He had rules. And the punishment for breaking them wasn't disproportionate. It was exact, calibrated. He returned what was given to him in precisely the measure it was given. Which meant that whoever had been siphoning $43,000 from his accounts through Vincent Harlow's routing codes was about to receive something very precise in return. If he knew. Nora looked at the numbers again. Then she looked at the date stamp on the most recent transfer. 3 days ago. She looked at her calendar. Thursday, 7 p.m., 2 hours from now. She thought about what she was going to do with this information for exactly 4 minutes. It was not a complicated decision, in the end. It was only a frightening one. She didn't go back upstairs after her shift. Instead, she went to the small supply closet, adjacent to the kitchen, and stood in the dark among the industrial cleaning products and the spare tablecloths. And she thought about the shape of what she knew and the shape of what she didn't know, and which of those two shapes was more dangerous. What she knew, the money was moving. It had been moving for 6 weeks. It was moving in a direction that pointed at Cosimo Brandt's head of security. What she didn't know, why, what it was for, who else was involved. What she suspected, based on 11 years of reading financial behavior, the way other people read body language. This was preparatory. You didn't skim $43,000 over 6 weeks through 11 careful transactions because you needed $43,000. You did it because you needed something that $43,000 could buy, and you needed the purchase to be invisible, and you needed the purchase to be completed before a specific date. She thought about what $43,000 bought in the world she worked in. Her stomach turned to ice. She found a notepad in the supply closet, a small one, the kind the waitstaff used to take orders, and she borrowed a pen from her blazer pocket, and she stood in the dark, and she wrote 11 digits and a routing code and 3 dates and 1 name. Then she folded the paper in half. Then she walked out to the floor. The restaurant was full. A Thursday in October, the kind of evening where the city felt like it was performing prosperity for its own audience. Every table occupied by people spending money they wanted to be seen spending. Nora moved through the room the way she always moved, efficiently, slightly sideways, occupying as little space as possible, which was its own kind of lie, because she had never actually taken up as little space as she made herself appear to. She'd spent years perfecting that particular contraction, years learning to fold herself down, pull herself in, make herself easy to overlook. It was not something she was proud of. It was something she was good at. Cosimo Brandt was in his corner booth. He was alone tonight, which was unusual. He normally had 2 men at the adjacent table. Not obviously guards, dressed too well for that, but positioned with the particular stillness of people who were always partly somewhere else in their heads, running threat assessments. Tonight there was only 1 man at the adjacent table, and he was not positioned with any kind of stillness. He was leaning forward, speaking in a low voice, and even from across the room Nora could read the microtension in his jaw, the set of his shoulders. The man speaking was Vincent Harlow. Nora stopped walking. She was holding a tray with 2 glasses of water. She'd picked it up from a passing server without thinking, an instinct for not being conspicuous. And she stood at the edge of the room, and she watched Vincent Harlow speak to the man, whose accounts Vincent Harlow had been quietly bleeding for 6 weeks, and she felt something cold and clarifying move through her chest. He was right there, sitting at the adjacent table, reporting to his boss, maybe giving some explanation, some update, some piece of information that would redirect suspicion, buy more time, or maybe he was already deep enough in whatever this was that there was no more time to buy, and what she was watching was the last meeting before the endgame. She thought about the number she had written down, the routing code, the dates. She thought about what came after $43,000. She thought about the 39 other people who worked in this building. Then she crossed the room. She'd never had reason to approach Cosimo Brandt directly. In 11 years, she had communicated with his organization exclusively through intermediaries. His CFO, his legal counsel, the two accountants who served as buffers between the actual books and the actual man. She was a third-floor fixture. She was furniture. She was the reason the numbers never gave anyone a reason to look twice. And she'd been compensated well for that reason. And the implicit understanding was that she would remain exactly where she was, doing exactly what she did, being noticed by exactly no one. She set the water glass down at his table without asking permission. He looked up from whatever he'd been reading. His eyes were grey, not the warm kind of grey, the kind that looked like concrete in winter. They registered her with the same calm, comprehensive attention he probably gave to everything, the way a security camera doesn't express anything but doesn't miss anything either. She did not sit down. She did not explain. She placed the folded notepad paper on the table next to the water glass, and she met those grey eyes for exactly 2 seconds. And then she picked up the empty glass that had been sitting at the edge of his table since she arrived, and she walked back toward the bar without varying her pace by a single beat. She did not look back. She counted to 30 while she stood at the bar and asked for the check for table 9. She counted to 30 again while she waited for it. She was aware of her heartbeat in a way she was not usually aware of her heartbeat. Specific and loud, like someone knocking on a door from the inside. On the second count of 30, she allowed herself to look. Cosimo Brandt had unfolded the paper. He was reading it with the expression of someone doing math, not alarmed, not performatively calm the way people looked when they were trying to hide alarm, actually, genuinely, eerily calm. The expression of a man who had already considered the possibility that something like this might happen and was now simply confirming the shape of it. He read it for a long time. Then he raised his eyes. He was not looking at Vincent Harlow. He was looking across the room at Nora. She looked away first. She made it back to her office on the 3rd floor without incident. She sat down at her desk. She opened the spreadsheet she'd been working on before any of this started, and she stared at it without reading it for approximately 4 minutes, before she accepted that she was not going to be able to work tonight, and she closed it. She did not know what was going to happen next. She had handed the man a piece of paper with evidence of his head of security's financial betrayal, and she had walked away, and now she was sitting in a room with a locked door and a very inadequate sense of what she had just set in motion. The knock came 40 minutes later. Not a knock, exactly. More of a single, deliberate impact, like someone who knew there was no need to knock twice. She opened the door. Cosimo Brandt was standing in the hallway. Alone, she checked, and there was no one visible in either direction, which meant there were absolutely people in both directions that she couldn't see. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive things fit, effortlessly and without apology, and he was holding her folded paper between 2 fingers. He looked at her for a moment with those grey eyes. Then he looked past her into the office, taking in the 3 monitors, the stacked filing boxes, the whiteboard covered in her handwriting, column after column of account numbers and dates and amounts, color-coded in a system she'd developed herself over a decade and never explained to anyone. "You work in this building," he said. It was not a question. His voice was lower than she'd expected, unhurried. "3rd floor," she said. "I'm the accountant, one of them. How long?" 11 years. He looked at the whiteboard again. "How long have you known about the transfers?" "I found them this morning," she said. "All of them go back 6 weeks. 11 transactions. The amounts are deliberately staged below your internal flagging threshold, but the routing codes all resolve to the same terminal account." And the date pattern is—" She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "The date pattern accelerates," she finished. "The intervals are getting shorter. The most recent transfer was 3 days ago. Before that, 8 days. Before that, 12. Whatever the transfers are funding, it's very close to completion." He was quiet for a moment. "Who else has seen this?" "No one," she said. "I keep the Monday reconciliations solo. That's always been the arrangement." "Why did you come to me instead of Alderman?" Alderman was the CFO. His name in her mouth felt strange. She almost never said it out loud. Nora looked at him steadily. "Because 3 of the 11 transactions cleared through accounts that Alderman countersigns." The quality of the silence changed. "I see," Cosimo Brandt said. He did not leave. He came into the office, not asking, not waiting for an invitation. Just entering the way people entered spaces they had decided belonged to them. And he looked at the whiteboard for a long time, and then he looked at her monitors, and then he sat in the chair across from her desk, which was a folding chair, because she'd never had anyone sit across from her desk before, and had not felt the need to invest in a second real chair. He sat in it like it was a throne. "Walk me through it," he said. So she did. She pulled up the reconciliation files, and she walked him through the transactions in chronological order, explaining the staging strategy, the routing chain, the terminal account, the pattern of acceleration. She talked for 22 minutes. He interrupted her 4 times, all with precise technical questions that told her he understood financial structures better than most accountants she'd worked with. He did not interrupt her to reassure her, or to express any emotion about what he was hearing. He simply listened and processed and asked what he needed to ask. When she finished, he said, "You said the date intervals are accelerating." "Yes. Your projection for the endpoint?" She hesitated. "I can't give you a specific date without more data, but based on the acceleration curve, the pattern suggests something in the next 5 to 10 days. Possibly sooner." She paused. "The funding amount isn't consistent with logistics or equipment. At this scale, through these channels, it looks like a payment to someone for something, one specific thing. For a contract," he said. He said it flatly, not like a question, and not like a revelation. Like a confirmation of something he had considered and found mathematically inevitable. Nora said nothing. He looked at her. "You understood that when you came downstairs?" "I had a reasonable hypothesis," she said carefully. "You walked across a restaurant and put a piece of paper in front of me because you had a reasonable hypothesis that Vincent Harlow was paying someone to kill me." Said plainly like that, it sounded either very brave or very stupid. She had spent 47 minutes not thinking about which one it was. "I was fairly confident in the hypothesis," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a softening of the concrete winter quality of it, like a brief interruption in weather. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nora Finch." He repeated it like he was filing it somewhere. "Nora Finch. 11 years. 3rd floor, yes. No one knew you were here. That was the arrangement." He looked at her for another moment. Then he took out his phone. She did not sleep that night. She wasn't asked to leave. Wasn't asked much of anything, actually. 2 men she'd never seen before appeared outside her office door within 15 minutes of Cosimo's phone call. And they did not speak to her, and she did not speak to them, and the implicit message was that she was to remain where she was for the foreseeable future. She worked. She pulled every transaction she could find that touched Harlow's access credentials, and she built a complete map of the financial picture. And by 2 a.m., she had a document that was 37 pages long, and color-coded and cross-referenced, and about as airtight as anything she'd ever produced. She slid it under the door when she heard movement in the hallway. She did not hear anything else for 2 hours. Then footsteps. A knock. 1. Deliberate. She opened the door. It was not one of the men from before. It was Cosimo himself, still in the charcoal suit, looking as though he had not slept either, but wearing it the way he wore everything, without any apparent concession to the experience of it. He held her 37 pages. "Harlow is in custody," he said. "His associates are being located." She nodded. "He's been talking." A pause. The contract was scheduled for Saturday. 2 days she had found the transfers with 2 days to spare. The thought landed with a physical weight somewhere behind her sternum. "And Alderman?" she asked. "Under review." His tone suggested this was the kind of review from which careers did not recover. She nodded again. She didn't know what was expected of her now, whether she was supposed to ask what happened next, or express relief, or simply return to her desk and pick up where she'd left off. The architecture of her role in this building had, in the last 8 hours, shifted in ways she hadn't fully mapped yet. "You've been here 11 years, he said. "Yes. In that time, no one on my staff flagged this account pattern. No. You found it in one morning." "I find things," she said simply. "That's what I do." He was looking at her with an expression she still couldn't fully categorize, but it had something in it that she was slowly, cautiously beginning to identify as attention, the real kind, not the performative interest of someone who wanted something from her, the kind of attention that meant someone was actually, genuinely seeing her. She was not accustomed to it. She did not quite know what to do with it. "I've been told," he said slowly, "that you've been running these reconciliations alone for 11 years, that you've never submitted a report with an error, that your filing system is." He glanced at the whiteboard, something the other 2 accountants have described as, quote, "impossible to understand but always correct." "It makes sense to me," she said, slightly defensive. "I don't doubt it." He paused. "I should have known your name before tonight." It was a simple statement. No apology in it, no performance of regret. Just a plain acknowledgement of a plain fact, delivered with the same quiet precision he seemed to apply to everything. It hit her somewhere unexpected. She'd spent 11 years being the furniture, and she'd told herself she was fine with it, that invisibility was utility, and utility was enough. And she'd believed that right up until this moment, standing in her doorway at 2 in the morning, with 37 pages of evidence in Cosimo Brandt's hands, and somewhere in her chest a door she'd bricked over a long time ago gave an uncertain, rusty creak. "You should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow there will be a significant amount to untangle." "I'm fine," she said, which was a lie, but a structural one, the kind that holds things up. "I know you are," he said, and somehow, coming from him, it did not sound like dismissal. It sounded like a different kind of being seen. "But tomorrow will require more of you. So rest." He turned to go. "Mr. Brandt," she said. He turned back. She wasn't sure why she'd said it, wasn't sure what she'd intended to follow it with. She stood in the doorway of the office she'd occupied for 11 years, in the building she'd never quite left behind, and she looked at the man she'd handed a piece of paper to across a crowded restaurant, and she said, "How did you know I was on the 3rd floor?" "Just now." He looked at her for a moment. "I made it a point to find out," he said. And then he was gone. The months that followed were not quiet. Alderman was removed. That was the sanitized version, and Nora did not ask questions about the less sanitized one. 3 additional members of the organization were identified through the financial map she'd built, their connections to Harlow's network traced through exactly the kind of patient, meticulous cross-referencing that she'd spent 11 years being paid not to be noticed doing. She rebuilt the accounting infrastructure from the ground up, with full access this time. Not just the 3rd floor and the shell accounts, but the entire picture, complete and unfiltered. She moved to a larger office on the 2nd floor. She got a second real chair. Cosimo Brandt made a habit of stopping by on Thursday afternoons. Not always for work. Sometimes for work. He had questions, she had answers. The financial architecture of the organization was being re-engineered, and there were decisions that required her input. But sometimes he simply came and sat in the real chair across from her desk and drank the coffee she kept in the small machine in the corner, and they talked. About the work, sometimes. About other things, slowly, carefully. The way two people talk when they're not used to talking and are doing it anyway because they've decided the alternative is worse. He told her about growing up between two languages, between two families, between two definitions of what loyalty meant. She told him about her mother's voice on the phone when she'd taken the job here, the careful absence of questions, the more careful absence of judgment. He told her that he didn't trust easily. She told him she'd figured that out. He told her that she was the most competent person in his organization. She told him that she'd always known that and it had never seemed to matter to anyone. It matters to me, he said. I know, she said. It's recent. Yes. He looked at her directly, the way he did everything, fully, without evasion. I'm aware of that. She looked back at him. She had spent 11 years learning to look away first. She found, lately, that she was doing it less. She was still the same person who had walked into this building at 20 and figured out that invisibility was a survival strategy. She still wore dark blazers. She still kept her hair up. She still sat in the back of every room she entered out of pure muscle memory. Those were habits that didn't unlearn overnight. But something had shifted in the weight she gave them. She had walked across a restaurant at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening and put a piece of paper in front of the most dangerous man in Chicago. And in doing so, she had proved something she had spent a decade trying not to believe about herself. That she was not someone who could afford to be invisible, that her intelligence was not a thing to be hidden and managed and turned sideways like a knife kept closed, that the patience and the precision and the way she saw patterns in things that other people looked straight through. These were not liabilities in need of concealment. They were weapons. Cosimo had said it plainly one evening in November, leaning back in the real chair with his coffee going cold on the corner of her desk. You know what I could never figure out? How someone like you ended up convinced that disappearing was the point. She'd thought about it. Someone like me, she repeated. Exactly like you, he said. No qualifier. She looked at him for a long moment. 11 years, she said finally. It's a lot of practice. You're retired from it, he said, simply. Like it was already decided. Like the decision had been made at some point and they were both just catching up to it now. She thought about the woman who had stood in a supply closet in the dark, writing numbers on a notepad, trying to make herself believe she was just doing her job, just following a procedure, just being competent and invisible and unremarkable. She thought about how that woman had walked out of the supply closet anyway, retired, she said, effective as of approximately 10 months ago, he said. When you crossed a very crowded restaurant and handed me the 11 most important numbers I've ever read. She laughed. Not a small laugh, a real one, the kind that came up from somewhere she hadn't accessed in a while. He watched her laugh with that expression she'd slowly learned to read. The one that wasn't quite a smile, but existed in the same territory. The one that meant he was seeing her clearly and had decided, on the basis of clear sight, that this was exactly where he intended to be. Outside, Chicago was doing what it did in November, which was perform winter with maximum commitment. The wind off the lake rattled the office window. The lights of the city were sharp and distant through the glass. Nora Finch, who had spent 11 years making herself furniture, who had learned invisibility like a second language and spoken it fluently until the moment it mattered, looked at the most dangerous man in the city, who was sitting in the second real chair she had ever owned, drinking her coffee, looking back at her, and she thought, so this is what it feels like to be seen. It felt against all expectation like something she could learn to live with.